Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a passage that, let's be honest, many people find profoundly uncomfortable, even a little disturbing.
That's a good way to put it.
We're moving beyond the common Sunday school summary and really getting into the deep architectural foundations of the early faith community.
That's right. This isn't a comfort food story. We are plunging into the account of Ananias and Sapphira from the book of Acts.
Yeah.
And if you've read it, you know it involves a sudden, terrifying judgment that follows what seems like a simple lie. It's one of the most sobering warnings in all of these ancient texts.
So we're examining sources today that really focus on interpreting this event. One of our sources even calls it the lie that shook the early church.
Which it absolutely did.
And our mission here is not just to recount the story, but to go beyond that, the shocking part of it and really answer the central question: why was the judgment so severe and why so swift? What was actually going on here?
Exactly. Because the initial reaction, I think, for most people is that it's about money, right? Yeah. It's about greed, some kind of financial punishment. But our sources argue, and I think very strongly, that this narrative is operating on a much, much deeper spiritual frequency.
Okay, so to get that, we need to understand the environment.
You have to. You have to understand the operating environment. This was not the church 50 or even 5 years later. This was the foundational moment, the very beginning.
Right, so let's set that stage. Context is everything here. The early church was in an absolute explosion of growth and spiritual vitality right after Pentecost.
It was an ecstatic, radical movement. It was all about transformation. Our sources paint this picture of a community that was so deeply knit together that they were actively, physically sharing everything they had.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is. The description is striking. It says believers were together and had everything in common. They were selling their possessions, their property, and then distributing the proceeds to anyone who had a need.
And it's important to stress this wasn't like a rule, right? It wasn't forced on them.
No, not at all. It was organic. It was this radical generosity just bubbling up, driven by this shared belief and this incredible hope. The whole community was built to ensure that, and the text says this explicitly, no one lacked. No one was alone.
That is just a staggering baseline for a community. It's not a weekly meeting. It's a total redefinition of your social and your economic life.
It is.
And if your well-being directly depends on the integrity of the person next to you, well, that raises the stakes for everything.
It absolutely does. They didn't think they were building just another human institution, with laws and ledgers. They believed they were building something guided by the Spirit, a divinely ordained fellowship.
So the integrity.
The spiritual integrity of that shared life was the most valuable asset they had, period. If that integrity is breached, especially by people who are choosing to perform piety instead of living it, the whole foundation is poisoned.
It's like a contamination.
That's the perfect word. It's why the concept of contamination is so critical here. We're dealing with a community where truth isn't just, a nice virtue to have. It's the literal lifeblood of their economic survival and their spiritual power.
And if people start lying about what they have, what they give, the whole thing just collapses.
Instantly. Because the trust is gone. And without trust, that community can't exist.
Okay, so with that really intense backdrop, let's bring in the main players here. Ananias and Sapphira, a married couple, and they're clearly part of this burgeoning radical community.
Right.
And the outline points out they sold a piece of land. And at first, that looks perfect. It looks like they're completely aligned with that communal spirit we just described. I mean, it's a profound act of generosity.
And that's the first layer of nuance we really need to peel back. Our sources are so careful to distinguish the act from the intention behind it. The act itself, selling the land, was generous.
Yes.
Their participation was welcomed. One source says, and I'm quoting here, generosity was not the problem. They were participating in this great movement. They made a real, tangible financial contribution.
But then comes the twist. They sell the land, they get the money, and then they decide to keep back a portion of it for themselves. And this is the point, I think, where a lot of people get confused and think that was the sin.
And that's where the source material provides this crystal clear clarification. They were not required to sell the land in the first place.
Right.
And once they sold it, they were not required to give the full amount to the community fund. Our source emphasizes, this is key, nothing wrong with that. Peter himself says this to Ananias later. He asks him, while it remained unsold, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not under your control?
Wow. That changes the dynamic completely. This wasn't some mandatory tithing issue or a failure to meet a financial quota from the apostles. It was entirely voluntary. It was their money.
Yeah.
So if keeping the money wasn't the sin, what was the crime here? What was the actual mechanism of it?
It was the presentation of the gift. The sin was in the pretending. They represented the amount they gave as the full total amount of the sale price.
So they wanted the credit for giving everything.
They wanted the reputation of complete surrender, of radical self-sacrifice, all the status that came with giving everything without actually sacrificing everything. It transformed their offering from what could have been genuine generosity into a deliberate spiritual performance, a show.
That is such a profound distinction. It means the issue was purely about what? Spiritual accounting versus financial accounting.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
They were trying to manufacture spiritual credit. I mean, given the context, this booming spirit-filled movement, how did they even think they could keep a secret like that? Did they just think the apostles were, counting coins?
I think that's exactly what they thought. I think their error was foundational. They treated the community leadership, Peter, John, all the apostles, as if they were just human treasurers, just administrators who could be fooled by a clever lie.
Who's going to check the land registry?
Exactly. If we tell Peter this is the total, who's going to audit the sale? Nobody. They were trying to optimize their spiritual status while minimizing their personal risk.
They wanted the glory of martyrdom without the actual death of their self-interest.
Perfectly said. And that brings us to the crucial part about the target of the lie, which Peter immediately highlights. Peter doesn't respond by saying, "How dare you cheat the church?" or "You defrauded us."
No, he goes bigger.
He elevates the crime immediately. He says that they had lied to God and specifically to the Holy Spirit.
And that shifts the entire narrative. It's not a financial dispute between people anymore. It becomes an integrity crisis before God.
Yeah.
Because if the community truly is guided by the Holy Spirit, which is what they all claimed, then lying to the treasurer is the same as lying to the divine observer who's actively guiding the community.
Right. They had seen miracles. They had seen profound spiritual alignment. And they believed they could walk into the central gathering of this community, the very epicenter of the Holy Spirit's presence, and execute a calculated deception without anyone knowing.
Their actions showed they just fundamentally doubted the spiritual transparency of the whole situation.
They did. So the motivation, it really just boils down to status. The source says they wanted to look more righteous than they truly were.
And in a community that's defined by who gives the most, who sacrifices the most, that spiritual capital becomes intensely valuable.
It did. I mean, imagine the social pressure. A leading figure like Barnabas had just sold a field and laid all the money at the apostles' feet.
And he would have been celebrated for it.
Oh, absolutely. Barnabas gained incredible status, incredible spiritual credibility. And Ananias and Sapphira clearly saw that status and thought, we want that praise, we want that esteem, but we also want a retirement fund.
It's the ultimate contradiction, isn't it? Trying to get outward validation in a community that was explicitly built on transparency and genuine surrender, they basically weaponized generosity to fuel their own ambition.
And that makes a sacred act profane. This hidden internal corruption of their motivation is the key element our sources keep emphasizing. They weren't penalized for their lack of wealth. They were penalized for introducing a deliberate self-serving lie into the most pure and critical phase of this community's existence.
It was a calculated risk.
A calculated risk to contaminate the entire spiritual atmosphere just for personal gain.
And that risk, as we're about to see, was fatal. Okay, this preparation brings us to the high drama of the story, as it's described in the source material, the confrontation. And the narrative structure is just brilliant. It splits the lie and the judgment into two separate, incredibly tense scenes.
Right, separated by 3 critical hours.
It just maximizes the tension, and, crucially, it gives one person a final chance to tell the truth.
The structure is narrative perfection. It moves with almost a judicial precision. There's no ambiguity. So scene 1, Ananias, he comes forward to present the offering. And Peter, who seems to be operating with this almost frightening spiritual clarity, he just immediately bypasses the financial issue.
And his question is terrifyingly direct. Why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back some of the proceeds of the land?
Notice that phrasing. He links the action directly to a spiritual corruption, a heart filled by a deceitful influence.
He doesn't pull any punches.
No. And he defines the action as lying to the Holy Spirit. And like we said before, Peter did not ask why he kept the money. The focus was entirely on the pretense, the source of the deception. The question is basically a statement of spiritual fact. We know you lied, and we know who motivated that lie.
how do the sources interpret Peter's ability to know this? I mean, was this just a common thing for the apostles, or was this a unique, specific moment of divine intervention?
The sources all seem to suggest this was a unique moment of profound, protective, spiritual discernment. The power Peter showed here, it wasn't meant to be like a daily audit of everyone's bank account.
All right, that would be terrifying.
It would be. No, this was a specific divine intervention that was necessary to enforce the rule that hypocrisy would not be tolerated at the foundation. It was setting a spiritual precedent for the whole community. It demonstrated that the Holy Spirit was truly active and aware within their ranks.
And the consequence, it's just absolute. But before Ananias can even formulate a defense or explain himself or maybe even confess, he just collapses.
Dead.
He's dead.
The source description is so stark. It says, no warning, no time to explain, no second chance. The swiftness is the whole point. It establishes the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a warning shot. This was an immediate spiritual judgment against a specific, calculated spiritual crime.
The integrity of the whole movement demanded that kind of clarity.
It did. And you're right, the suddenness is what shocks modern readers, but it must have been utterly paralyzing for that early community. It would force a complete reassessment of what it means to be in the active presence of God's Spirit.
It underscores that the spiritual state of your heart is just instantly transparent to the divine.
And that contamination in that foundational environment is just intolerable. This consequence defined the boundaries of the community, a boundary drawn around radical truth.
So now we get this interlude, this 3-hour gap. The text says some young men wrapped up Ananias' body, carried him out, and buried him. And this little pause is brilliant narrative pacing, but it also has these profound spiritual implications for his wife, Sapphira.
Oh, the 3 hours just hang in the air. It's a window of opportunity that Sapphira tragically misses. She enters, and she has no idea what just happened. She thinks her husband is off doing routine business, maybe even coming home with their reputation enhanced.
The source describes her as smiling, unaware.
Yes, thinking they had played the perfect religious game. She walks right into a tragedy expecting applause.
And that detail just emphasizes the depth of their joint commitment to the performance. She wasn't just, a passive accomplice. She was an active participant in this whole facade.
And Peter gives her a clear, precise opportunity to choose truth. He doesn't accuse her right away. He sets the stage for her. She can either confess or she can confirm the lie. He asks her very directly, tell me whether you sold the land for so much.
That is the ultimate test. It's an open door to redemption. She could have said, no, Peter, we sold it for more, and my husband convinced me to keep some back. I'm so sorry, I confess.
But she doesn't.
She confirms the false amount. She chooses the status, the shared financial secret, the reputation. She chooses all of that over the truth.
This is the critical moment. She seals her fate by choosing to maintain the facade, even when her husband is mysteriously absent. This confirms that the lie was a shared, deliberate project. She had 3 hours. 3 hours to notice Ananias was gone, to maybe feel a little uneasy, but she chose to trust the lie.
And by confirming the lie, she basically ratifies the whole deception. Peter's pronouncement is just devastating in its symmetry.
It's chilling. How could you agree to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also.
And the consequence follows immediately. She falls down dead. And the dual nature of the judgment just makes this complete and powerful statement.
The responsibility was shared, and the consequence was delivered to both parties independently, but they were definitively linked by their shared willful deception. The narrative closes the door on any possibility that this was just a rash decision by Ananias. No, this was a partnership in pretense.
The precision is unnerving, but it achieves the goal. It leaves absolutely no doubt that this lie was deemed an intolerable offense against the spiritual reality of the early church.
It's a swift divine surgery. That's what it is. It's needed to excise the infection of hypocrisy before it can spread.
Okay, so now we have to move into the vital analytical phase. This is where we need to be really deliberate. We have to address the inevitable question. Why was this judgment so extreme? Why did a financial lie lead to immediate death when other sins, other serious sins, seem to have been treated with grace and patience?
This is the interpretive key. It's where our source material is most insistent. We have to move past the idea that this was just about money.
It's not about the dollars and cents.
No. If this were simply about greed or some kind of mandatory giving, the message would be vastly different and, frankly, highly confusing, especially given what Peter said earlier about them having total control over their property.
So let's just systematically review the source's checklist of what the sin wasn't. It explicitly states their sin wasn't just greed and isolation. It wasn't a financial crime against the church's bank account. And crucially, it wasn't punishment for keeping part of the profit.
The core transgression, the sin that was deemed so intolerable for the community's foundation, was hypocrisy. The deliberate, self-serving deception aimed at gaining spiritual status and community approval through a manufactured appearance.
That distinction is monumental. It takes the focus completely off the external act, the money, and puts it squarely on the integrity of the heart, on their spiritual practice. They were punished for performing righteousness, not for failing to be perfectly generous.
Exactly. And our sources elevate hypocrisy to the highest level of spiritual threat. They point out that Jesus himself condemned the hypocrisy of the religious leaders, the Pharisees, more than any other sin.
So why? Why is hypocrisy so uniquely destructive, especially in a brand new spiritual movement? I mean, if someone was just a blatant thief, the community could deal with that. But this lie was so subtle, so internal.
Because a blatant thief or an open sinner of any kind is visible, the community can see it, identify the boundaries, and respond to the brokenness. Hypocrisy, though. Hypocrisy is insidious. It wears the mask of righteousness.
And that's the danger.
It's the ultimate danger. If your foundational members, and Ananias and Sapphira, were clearly people of means and influence, if they establish that spiritual performance is what gets rewarded, then everyone else is forced to live a double life just to feel included.
It creates this catastrophic systemic effect. The sources warn that if hypocrisy is allowed to flourish, it destroys churches, it poisons community, and it fundamentally corrupts the heart.
Let's trace the practical damage. Imagine you're a new believer, you're financially struggling, and you sell a small plot of land. You give 40% because you genuinely need the other 60% to feed your family.
Which would have been fine.
It would have been celebrated. But then Ananias, who's richer, comes in and pretends he gave 100% and he's lauded for his radical surrender. What happens to the struggling believer? He feels immense shame, immense pressure.
He's forced into a choice.
Exactly. Either he withdraws from the community feeling like a total spiritual failure, or he starts lying himself to gain that same spiritual capital.
And that's how the poison spreads. It shifts the entire culture from genuine sacrificial support to spiritual competition. The community that was built on no one lacked becomes defined by who looks the most self-sacrificial. Trust just evaporates.
The integrity of the whole communal sharing system relied entirely on the honesty of its members. Honesty about their needs and their capacity. When Ananias breached that honesty for the sake of his reputation, he didn't just destroy his own integrity, he challenged the very spiritual contract the community operated under.
He treated the sacred treasury as a stage for his own vanity.
He did. And that contextual implication that the integrity of the whole system was at stake is so crucial. The source suggests this story wasn't recorded simply to terrify us or to create some new rule about total giving. The ultimate purpose was to wake us.
What does that mean, to wake us?
The judgment was immediate because the community was like fresh, wet concrete. You have to set the standard immediately. If a crack or a structural flaw gets introduced at that foundational moment, the whole building will eventually fail.
So the Holy Spirit acted decisively to protect the integrity of the system.
Before the infection of pretense could spread and become institutionalized, it was a spiritual surgery, a radical excision of the infection before it became normalized. We have to understand that the one thing God will not tolerate in the foundation of his community is deliberate, self-serving deception aimed at manipulating spiritual status.
And that's why Peter links it to Satan filling the heart. The deception wasn't just a mistake or a white lie.
No, it was a calculated attempt to challenge the spiritual truth, that the Holy Spirit was the real active agent and observer in that community. By claiming credit they hadn't earned, they were essentially trying to trick God and corrupt the purity of his work.
And if the movement had continued with Ananias and Sapphira being celebrated as spiritual heroes,
the standard would have become fraud. The story acts as a permanent historical marker, saying, this movement is built on authenticity, and nothing less is acceptable at its foundation.
It just forces us to ask these tough questions about our own internal motivations, doesn't it? Are we more concerned with what our community sees, our outward performance, or the truth of our internal surrender? The story doesn't actually end with the burials, though. It moves into the collective response from the community.
Right.
What was the immediate fallout?
The text says, "Great fear seized the whole church and all who heard about these events."
And it's so crucial to analyze the nature of this fear. Our sources are very clear to clarify this wasn't just a human paralyzing fear of Peter.
Or just a general terror of being punished for every little mistake.
No, this was fear of God's holiness.
Fear of holiness, that's fundamentally different from fear of punishment. It's a profound realization that God sees through every facade, every rationalization, every carefully constructed spiritual image we try to project.
It's the realization of the absolute transparency that's required in God's presence. It's the kind of fear that wakes you up.
That's the phrase the source uses. It compels immediate, uncomfortable self-reflection. When people realized that Peter had this kind of discernment and that the Holy Spirit was actively policing the community's integrity, they would immediately start to examine their own hearts.
That instant shift in the atmosphere would have dramatically changed how people interacted. No one would dare try to posture or pretend anymore. It enforces this transparent vulnerability as the new community standard.
And this leads directly to the reflective questions our source material poses for us today. For you, the listener, this story is preserved to force us to ask, what am I pretending to be? And what lie am I living that God already sees and that is subtly poisoning my relationships?
Because if we're only concerned with what our neighbors or our colleagues or fellow church members see, we've completely missed the core principle of a faith that's built on an internal, genuine relationship with God.
That pursuit of external validation is exhausting, and it's ultimately fruitless.
But here's the necessary counterbalance to the severity, right? We have to make sure the message doesn't just become paralyzing.
Absolutely. Our sources remind us of a critical truth. The God who judged Ananias and Sapphira is the same God who restores, forgives, and transforms today.
So this shifts the story's ultimate purpose. It's not a permanent threat. It's a radical invitation toward truth.
Yes, it confirms that the issue was the state of their heart, the deliberate, ambitious lie, not some draconian law about money. God doesn't demand moral perfection in our day-to-day actions. We all stumble.
But he asks for authenticity.
He absolutely asks for authenticity in our hearts. He asks for authenticity, truth. The judgment was so swift and absolute because the lie was deliberate, it was self-serving, and it was introduced at the exact moment when foundational truth was the only thing required.
The danger ultimately isn't failure, it's fraud.
That's it. The failure to give 100% would have been met with grace, with acceptance, maybe even with assistance. The fraud, the pretense of giving 100%, was met with immediate judgment.
The source concludes that the moment our faith becomes a performance, that is the moment we lose the very thing that gives our walk with God power.
Because the power of faith lies in it being grounded in reality. When we pretend, we're seeking human applause for actions we haven't genuinely completed in the spiritual realm. And in doing that, we cut ourselves off from the genuine source of grace. We're trying to run on the vapor of reputation instead of the fuel of truth.
And that really is the enduring message, isn't it? That performance motive is so deeply embedded in human nature. We want the spiritual benefits without the surrender. Ananias and Sapphira just provide the ultimate illustration that in a community defined by the Spirit, you can't serve two masters, the truth and the appearance of truth.
And that pursuit of appearance always leads to hiding. That hiddenness is exactly what this story aims to abolish. It's a foundational statement that within this community, there is no place for masks, especially if those masks are worn to manipulate social or spiritual standing.
The swift, severe reactions serve to instantly enforce a culture of transparent vulnerability.
Everyone who survived knew instantly that they had to be radically honest about their surrender and their capacity.
And it also acted as a powerful filter, didn't it? The text suggests that after this, while great fear seized the whole church, the people who joined afterwards, they weren't doing so lightly.
No, not at all. They weren't seeking social status. Only those who were genuinely committed to that radical honesty and the commitment it required would dare to associate themselves with the group. It purified the community's membership criteria almost overnight.
It prioritized depth over breadth at a really critical moment.
It did. So if we look at the historical function of this traumatic event, it was less about punishing two people for money and everything about defining the existential requirements for the integrity of the institution they were trying to create. It was a foundational, non-negotiable definition of what it means to be Spirit-led.
And what that means is absolute internal truth.
Regardless of the cost. #outro.
This has been a necessary, if pretty intense, deep dive into a narrative that often causes a lot of confusion, but which carries one of the most vital messages for any community that's seeking to operate in truth.
So important.
We've seen the devastating cost of pretense, the lie of hypocrisy versus the radical and difficult requirement of authenticity.
And the story of Ananias and Sapphira. It ultimately serves a restorative purpose. It's not meant to instill this paralyzing fear. It's meant to demand genuine, unadulterated reality in our spiritual lives. It is paradoxically about freedom.
The freedom to be exactly who you are without the exhausting obligation of keeping up a perfect spiritual performance for the world around you.
And this freedom, our source reminds us, it only comes when nothing is hidden and everything is surrendered. This story challenges you directly, the listener, to examine your own hidden narratives.
Are there places in your life where you've been pretending, whether that's in financial generosity or maybe in your knowledge or your personal conviction? Where is the hidden portion of the land sale that you're still trying to claim credit for surrendering?
That act of transparent surrender, which is the exact antithesis of the Ananias and Sapphira lie, is the true pathway to genuine spiritual power. Because when you stop seeking human applause, you begin to receive divine acceptance.
Powerful stuff. Thank you for joining us on this particularly sobering and deeply analytical deep dive.
Always a pleasure to unpack these crucial foundations.